Deep in the forests of Siberia, there once stood a place that didn't exist on any map. No name, no coordinates, no record, only whispers carried by the icy winds. They called it Black Valley, a name spoken quietly among soldiers, prisoners, and the few who dared to survive Stalin's rule. It wasn't an ordinary prison. It was a fortress built to vanish people from history itself. A place where no one entered and no one left. When Joseph Stalin rose to power in the 1920s, he built his empire not just on ideology, but on fear. The Soviet leader believed that every whisper of dissent was a threat, every free thought, a spark waiting to burn his empire down. And so, he gave birth to his most terrifying creation, the NKVD, his secret police. Men whose loyalty wasn't to the law, but to Stalin alone. Their mission was clear: find the enemies of the state and erase them. But as the years went by, Stalin's paranoia grew. He no longer trusted even the NKVD. He began to suspect his own guards, his generals, even his closest allies. And that's when the idea of a secret prison was born. A place not even the NKVD could reach. Hidden behind frozen rivers and snow-covered ridges, construction began in silence. Thousands of prisoners were forced to build it, not knowing they were digging their own graves. Those who finished the work disappeared. Inside, the walls were lined with steel and concrete, thick enough to muffle screams. Guards were hand-picked, trained not to question, not to think. Each one signed an oath that if they ever spoke of what they saw, their families would vanish too. Officially, Black Valley didn't exist. Unofficially, it became the darkest chapter of Stalin's rule. People didn't arrive there through trials, courts. They were brought in black trucks at night, eyes covered, wrists chained. Writers, soldiers, scientists, mothers, anyone accused of thought crimes. Some had spoken a joke about Stalin. Others had simply been envied by a neighbor, and once inside, they were never seen again. Food was scarce. Sleep was a weapon. Guards woke prisoners every hour to keep them broken. Confessions were extracted not by truth, but by pain. And when Stalin wanted to make someone disappear completely, even their names were erased from records. But in 1940, something happened that terrified even the guards. A train arrived, not with prisoners, but with documents and scientists. They were told to build something inside the prison, something secret even to them. What they built remains one of history's great mysteries. Some say it was an underground lab. Others claim it was a psychological experiment, a place where human endurance was pushed to its limit. All we know is that by the end of that year, every scientist was gone. When Stalin died in 1953, the new Soviet leadership tried to bury the truth. Files vanished, witnesses disappeared, but a few fragments survived. Fragments found decades later in declassified KGB archives. Among them was a letter, written by an unknown prisoner, smuggled out through a guard. It said, "They told us this place was built to protect the revolution, but all I see are ghosts. Ghosts of men who once believed in it." That letter, historians say, came from Black Valley, and it remains the only piece of written evidence that the prison ever existed. But the question still haunts every researcher who's ever studied Stalin's reign. If Black Valley truly existed, what secrets were buried there? And why, even after 70 years, does Russia still deny it ever happened? No one ever saw Black Valley from the sky. The prison's roof was covered with snow year-round, its chimneys disguised as frozen ridges. Even satellite images decades later showed nothing but white emptiness. But for those trapped inside, it was a living nightmare. Prisoners described endless tunnels carved deep into the permafrost. cold corridors echoing with the sound of dripping water and boots on stone. Each tunnel led to small cells barely big enough to stand in. There were no windows, no sunlight, only flickering bulbs that buzzed weakly before dying in the cold. The prisoners never knew what day it was. Time itself disappeared. Every morning, guards walked through the corridors with metal rods banging on the cell doors, not to wake them, but to remind them they were still alive. Food came once a day. A bowl of thin soup, sometimes just warm water with a few grains of rice. Those who couldn't stand to eat were beaten until they did. It wasn't just physical torture that broke them. It was silence. Days without a voice, weeks without a name. You became no one. And that, historians believe, was Stalin's true purpose for this prison. Not to punish bodies, but to erase identities. In one section, there was a room known as the chamber. No one knew its real purpose. Prisoners who entered never returned. But years later, fragments of Soviet archives suggested it was part of a secret experiment, testing human resistance to isolation and psychological pressure. Guards were told the prisoners were traitors of the mind, that they deserved to vanish. But some guards couldn't bear it. A few went mad, others took their own lives. One of them, a man named Sergei Antonov, left behind a diary, a small notebook he buried under the snow before he fled the camp. In one passage, he wrote, "They scream without sound. They look at us like ghosts, and we become ghosts with them. This place eats the soul." For decades, no one found Sergei's diary. It was only uncovered in the 1980s, when a group of Soviet geologists stumbled upon metal ruins buried in permafrost. Inside a rusted locker, they found the book, frozen but still readable. And through his words, the world glimpsed, for the first time, what life inside Black Valley really was. The diary described experiments so horrifying they sound impossible. Prisoners were kept awake for days in total darkness, their only light being a single flame they were forbidden to blow out. Others were placed in soundproof chambers for weeks. Some went blind from the darkness. Others stopped speaking altogether, even after being released. It was said the NKVD wanted to find out how long a human could survive without hope, how long before the mind breaks. And when one scientist reportedly protested, Stalin's answer was simple: a man without hope can never betray. By 1943, as the war with Germany raged on, the experiments at Black Valley shifted. They began studying psychological endurance for soldiers, using prisoners as subjects. Some were told they could earn freedom if they survived. None ever did. In one final entry, Sergei wrote, "They built this place to protect the state from enemies. But the real enemy is here, in these walls, in these orders, in the silence that swallows men whole." After that line, the diary ends. No one knows what happened to Sergei Antonov. Some believe he escaped. Others say he was caught and brought back, his body thrown into the frozen river behind the compound. But after Stalin's death in 1953, strange things began happening. Trains that once brought prisoners stopped coming. Supplies halted. And within weeks, the prison seemed to have been abandoned overnight. When Soviet investigators finally reached the site years later, they found nothing but collapsed tunnels and rusted gates. No records, no bodies. Only traces of burned documents and frozen ash. It was as if the prison had been erased, not just from maps, but from history itself. Yet, one survivor's voice would emerge decades later, a man who claimed to have lived through the horror and escaped. He said he knew what was buried deep beneath Black Valley, and why Stalin never wanted the world to see it. In 1967, 2 decades after Stalin's death, a frail man appeared at the Soviet embassy in Helsinki. He called himself Ivan Petrovich. His clothes were torn, his voice trembling. But what he carried would shake the Soviet Union's carefully built wall of silence. Ivan claimed he had escaped from Black Valley. He said the place was not a prison. It was a laboratory. At first, no one believed him. But when Finnish authorities examined his arms, they found scars, circular burns, needle marks, and numbers etched faintly into his skin. Not tattoos, not branding, but chemical corrosion, as if something had been tested on him. Through translators, Ivan told his story, and it began deep under the frozen ground. He said there were 3 levels in Black Valley. The first, where common prisoners were held. The second, where scientists operated. And the third, the one even guards feared, was simply called the Silence. No one ever returned from the Silence. Ivan was sent there after refusing to sign a confession that he was an enemy of the people. He described endless corridors lit by red lamps, metal doors that opened only once a week. Inside, prisoners were forced to sit in small boxes for hours, while loud mechanical noises blasted through hidden speakers. It wasn't random. The sounds were meant to disorient, to erase memory, to break the human mind. Ivan said they tested different frequencies, sometimes low enough to make the chest vibrate, other times high-pitched tones that caused nosebleeds and hallucinations. He saw men claw their ears until they bled. He saw others whisper to walls, convinced they were hearing voices. The scientists never spoke to them directly. They watched from behind thick glass, taking notes as the prisoners broke apart. Slowly, methodically, scientifically. But the worst came when they brought in the light. Ivan said it was a machine, a high-intensity beam fixed to the ceiling of the chamber. When activated, it filled the room with blinding white light. He was forced to stand under it for hours, eyes open, unable to move. When it finally turned off, he could no longer see properly for weeks. Many went permanently blind. Later, Ivan learned that these tests were part of a psychological warfare project, an attempt to discover how far human endurance could be pushed, and how light, sound, and isolation could control the human brain. But why test it on prisoners? Because, according to Stalin's logic, traitors have no rights, only uses. Ivan survived by chance. One night, a massive snowstorm hit the region, cutting power across the facility. In the chaos, one of the outer tunnels collapsed. Ivan crawled through the debris, half buried, freezing, and somehow made it out. He wandered through the tundra for days, living off melted snow and scraps of frozen bark. When Finnish hunters found him, he was unconscious, his body frostbitten but alive. What he told them over the next weeks horrified even the most skeptical investigators. He described the scientists' accents, some Russian, others German. He said many of the experiments resembled the Nazi tests conducted at Dachau and Auschwitz, but these were happening years after the war had ended, under Stalin's secret orders. The question was why. Some historians later suggested that Stalin's inner circle had captured German scientists after 1945 and relocated them to hidden Soviet facilities, forcing them to continue their research in complete secrecy. Black Valley, according to this theory, was one of those facilities. Ivan's testimony was quietly suppressed. Soviet agents arrived in Helsinki within days, demanding his extradition. The Finnish government refused, but Ivan vanished soon after. Some said he fled to Sweden. Others claimed the KGB found him before he could speak publicly. All that remained were his interviews, recorded on magnetic tapes, later smuggled to the West by a journalist named Eric Lane. Those tapes surfaced decades later in 1991, after the fall of the Soviet Union. In one haunting segment, Ivan's trembling voice can be heard saying, "They said we were protecting the motherland, but what I saw was not protection, it was madness. When the recordings were released, Russian officials called them Western propaganda. But fragments of newly opened Soviet archives hinted otherwise. Documents referenced a site matching Ivan's description, Facility 72BV. The BV, some believed, stood for Black Valley. In those files were orders signed by top NKVD officials, authorizing special psychological trials for state protection. The documents ended abruptly in 1953, the same year Stalin died. After his death, his successor, Nikita Khrushchev, launched a series of quiet cleanups, burying evidence, destroying files, and dismantling certain classified installations in the Arctic. Among them, a facility known simply as 72BV, but not everything was erased. Satellite imagery from the late Cold War showed strange patterns in the ice, perfectly geometric outlines where buildings once stood. To this day, no one knows exactly what happened there, but Ivan's words still echo like a ghost through time. We were buried under the snow, so the world would never know. For decades, Black Valley remained nothing more than a rumor, a whisper shared among ex-intelligence officers and defectors. But in 1993, 2 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, a small team of Russian journalists decided to find out if the legend was real. They followed the coordinates mentioned in Ivan's smuggled testimony, north of Vorkuta, beyond the permafrost, where even the trees refused to grow. The journey took them across miles of frozen tundra. By the third day, their Geiger counters began to click. Radiation, faint but unnatural. Something had once operated there. Then they saw it. Half buried in snow and silence stood a concrete doorway sealed with thick steel bars. On its side, faint Cyrillic letters barely visible under frost read, Facility 72BV. They had found it. Inside, the air was thick with decay. Old Soviet gas masks littered the ground. Walls were scorched black, and everywhere, silence. No birds, no wind, just the distant groaning of the Arctic ice shifting above them. As they moved deeper, they found what Ivan had described decades earlier. Narrow corridors, glass observation windows, and strange metal restraints bolted to the walls. In one chamber, a giant circular light fixture still hung from the ceiling, its wires frayed, its purpose unmistakable. It was the light. Nearby, on a corroded metal table, they discovered stacks of film reels sealed in rusted canisters. Most were labeled with numbers, but one carried a title, Phase 5, Cognitive Response. They didn't dare open it there. The cold was unbearable, and the structure creaked with every step. They took what they could and escaped before nightfall. 2 weeks later, back in Moscow, the footage was developed. What they saw made one of the cameramen vomit. The film showed prisoners sitting in metal chairs, their eyes forced open with clamps. Blinding light flooded their faces while scientists in lab coats took notes. In the next reel, men were confined in tiny boxes, twitching, screaming, their minds clearly gone. A voice could be heard in the background, repeating in Russian, "Endurance defines loyalty. Loyalty defines survival." These weren't interrogation sessions. They were experiments. When the journalists tried to publish their findings, their story was blocked within hours. Their offices were raided. 2 members of the team disappeared. The remaining files, including the footage, were confiscated by the Federal Security Service, the FSB. Officially, the Russian government denied everything, but unofficially, former KGB insiders confirmed it. One retired officer, speaking under the pseudonym Major V, said, "Black Valley wasn't built to punish enemies. It was built to understand obedience, to study how far fear could be used as control." That statement changed everything. because it meant Stalin's prison wasn't just about torture. It was about perfecting control through fear, a concept that would echo through the decades of Soviet rule. When Western researchers gained limited access to declassified Soviet archives in the late 1990s, they uncovered fragments of a chilling program labeled Project Cerebro. In Russian, cerebro means silver, but its real meaning was darker. The project's goal: to develop psychological conditioning methods that could erase individuality, turning prisoners into emotionless, obedient subjects. Some scientists called it silver in the mind. It was this project, historians believe, that created Black Valley. By the early 2000s, only ruins remained, buried under decades of snow and secrecy. But satellite scans still showed faint traces of the underground complex. Even today, the Russian government restricts access to that region, labeling it a toxic site due to industrial contamination. But locals tell a different story. They speak of nights when the snow glows faintly and strange metallic hums echo beneath the ground. Old hunters claim that when the wind is still, you can hear voices, faint, pleading, as if the frozen earth itself remembers those who were never buried. And perhaps that's true, because history has a way of remembering what men try hardest to erase. In 2015, declassified CIA documents revealed that American intelligence had also investigated Facility 72BV in the 1950s. Their conclusion was chilling. Evidence suggests the Soviet Union conducted neuropsychological trials on human subjects in a remote Arctic region. Purpose: unknown. Outcome: terminated post-Stalin. But the final line was the most haunting. Remnants of the facility remain active even decades after its supposed closure. Whether that was a mistake or a warning, no one knows. But for the few who have seen the surviving footage, the message is clear. Black Valley was never just a prison. It was a mirror, showing how far humanity could fall in its pursuit of power and control. And as long as that hunger exists, the story of Stalin's secret prison isn't truly over. It simply waits, frozen beneath the snow, for the next hand to uncover it.